Leading up to a swearing-in, President Biden unveiled the American Rescue Plan, an expansive relief package with a nearly $2 trillion price tag. Now, when he took office, the president quickly signed an executive order delivering some of the plan's measures. But for the rest, congressional action is needed. So, nearly 3 weeks into his presidency, where does everything stand right now? Well, here's what we know. President Biden and Vice President Harris, they met on Monday with a group of Republican senators about the plan. And those senators were actually on board with some of it, including the $160 billion in funding for a national vaccination program and expanded testing. But there's a lot they don't agree on, like the size of those stimulus checks. So let's do some quick math here. The Senate has a slim Democratic majority with the vice president as the tie-breaking vote. Bills need 60 votes to pass, and 10 Republicans are holding out. So is it a stalemate? Well, not quite. Democrats can pass the plan as it stands using a special procedure called budget reconciliation. The House cleared the way for that last night. Reconciliation would allow Democrats in the Senate to pass the measure with a simple majority vote instead of the usual 60 votes. That means Democrats could pass this package without Republican support. But if the president could get those 10 Republican senators on board, he would have the 60 votes to pass it under normal Senate procedures. According to the Associated Press, President Biden has signaled he is willing to compromise not on the stimulus check amount, but on who gets them, potentially capping eligibility at individuals making $50,000 a year and families making $100,000.